Okay, so Thomas, we have a question from you, so please pop up and ask your question.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, so thank you guys for your talk. Dr. Kharasch, I was just wondering if you could perhaps give us a little insight or your thoughts on the role of just ourselves as student researchers, but also just perhaps the peer review process and journals in general, especially during this time of pandemic where anything COVID related is literally fast tracked and published within like a month. And that has led to, at least from what I've seen, and it's very little, but journals that have ended up retracting, like very big journals that have retracted papers due to very many different reasons. So what are your thoughts on that and comments or anything?
Peer review is one of the foundations of scholarly publishing. And good peer review takes time. And in scholarly publishing, there is sometimes a balance between speed and quality. And I don't think that either one alone is ideal. Imbalance is not optimal. What you referred to was in some cases either bypassing or really short-stopping the peer review process. And unfortunately, there were manuscripts where the peer review process, either because it wasn't done or it wasn't done properly or it was done too quickly, was not appropriate and didn't serve the science well and didn't serve the readers well. So I think that in this time where there can be an emphasis on speed, I don't think that we can neglect the importance of quality. And so the peer review process has endured for 350 years. It's still a good process. And I think it's the optimal process. The consequence is that manuscripts whose messages may not be valid may end up being published. Clinical decisions could be made based on that information. The public could get the wrong information. And it's important to keep in mind that the entire realm of science rests on the public trust. The public spends $60 billion a year on scientific investigation because they believe that they're getting their money's worth. And that's sort of what we call the public trust. And it's important that we respect and maintain and hold that public trust, because if the public no longer believes that they can trust the information, then they will be far less willing to have their tax dollars support the efforts which generate that information.
Thank you. And can I just ask a follow-up? So I think one of the papers I was referring to, I think was in the Lancet, and there was they just retracted it because the data was not very accessible, and it was not a process that they could actually peer review that. And so I think for me, I definitely see that impact on the public trust. And I guess I wonder if there needs to be any sort of more rigorous or perhaps punitive measures that are kind of put in place to, I guess, reduce the chances of those things happening. Because as you said, like when we lose the trust of the public, we start like, it just, in my mind, it's like a slippery slope where we just things start unwinding really quickly.
Yeah, I think that the degree of rigor of peer review differs from journals. As the editor of anesthesiology, I can tell you that our peer review process is very rigorous. If you've ever submitted something to the journal, you will appreciate that the peer review process is very rigorous. And so I think that journals have an opportunity and obligation to execute that rigor. We can't legislate morality and we can't legislate quality, but I think it's incumbent upon journals to conduct peer review with the greatest rigor possible. And authors, because the peer review process is both evaluative, but also one which results in improvement, you want to be submitting manuscripts to journals which do execute a careful peer review process, because it will improve the quality of the manuscripts.
Deb, Dr. Culley, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that that's really important to take into consideration. It's very difficult when you get your first set of reviews back. I can remember being a very young person and basically wanting to just cry because there were like 15 pages of reviews. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration. And, you know, it said revise and reconsider or something like that. And I'm thinking, they're not going to reconsider this. What is it? And I walk into my mentor, and this is the key component there when you first get one of those. And I said, oh, the manuscript's just been rejected. And he said, let me read it. He says, are you kidding? This is a shoo-in. You don't have to do that much work. So while the peer review process is really hard and really vigorous, you just have to take it with that attitude that they're doing that not to you, but for you, so that your manuscript can be so much better than it was when it was started.
We don't have any more questions yet, so I get to ask a question, which, as you know, I love to do. I don't know how much both of you are on social media, but there's been a bunch of blow-ups recently. This is a little bit related to Thomas's question, where bias, racial, ethnic, or gender bias was missed in the review process. I think about the professionalism article in the Journal of Vascular Surgery, I think, which came out as #MedBikini for anyone who missed it. I just wonder what you think about how to ensure that biases that are probably baked into our reviewers as well don't get through the review process. I also think those journals somehow decided that the articles were important from their perspective and they didn't do as good a review as they could have done. But what are your thoughts on that component of integrity of review?
Well, I can speak for anesthesiology, where each article is evaluated by what we call a handling editor. And then they generally, if they decide that they want to have it reviewed, will have it reviewed by 2 reviewers. And we emphasize to our handling editors that they need to evaluate manuscripts for issues such as that. We ask them to evaluate manuscripts for the appropriate inclusion of sex, for example, and what we call sex is a biological variable. And in fact, we consider this as being so important that we recently published an editorial on this, where the proper inclusion and representation of sex as a biological variable is something that really came to the forefront more than a decade ago in clinical research. It's been a little bit more recent in terms of animal research. It's really the responsibility of funders to make sure that their grantees are discharging these responsibilities appropriately. But as the reviewers of manuscripts, we can make sure that authors have been totally transparent in terms of these kinds of issues. We can't always make them go back and repeat the study. Sometimes we may decide that the omissions are so egregious that we won't accept the paper. Other times we'll tell the authors that they need to be very transparent in explaining to the readers exactly what they did, what their demographics look like, why they did, what the limitations are, and what the interpretations are. Our purview is the reporting of research. Our purview is not the conduct of research. But we can make sure that it's reported appropriately.
Dr. Culley, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, the only other thing that I think is very important to remember is that we all live in different demographic regions. And so I find myself constantly wondering whether or not the work that I do is applicable to individuals who are not white or who do not have at least a college education. And I know that that's the minority of the population in the United States, but in Boston, almost everybody's pretty white and almost everyone is has a college degree or above. And so we've started reporting on both of those things as well in our manuscripts, and I would encourage you to do the same. I can't do anything about the environment in which I live, but I would hate for someone to extrapolate that information to individuals that were less well educated or groups of individuals that were of a different race or ethnicity.
Okay, while I'm waiting for more questions, I will ask another one. So this summer we've had 8 journal clubs that have reviewed 16 different articles. The students presented them, so I thought it was really interesting for them to see the flip side of ripping apart an article to present it to a journal club versus putting together an article to submit it. One of the things that's interesting is the articles that were chosen by our mentors ranged from those that were NIH funded to those that were funded by the institution or not funded. I wonder if you have thoughts on if there's what you think about potential differences in quality depending on whether it's funded by a federal agency or a foundation or somehow internally funded. How do those kinds of papers differ? I stumped the experts.
Well, I'm more than willing to say something. I would be very cautious if you're approaching a mentor in particular who has a lot of publications in a variety of areas, which means that they're really not an expert in that area. And I would wonder whether or not those types of individuals are doing things like data mining or not hypothesis generated research, and that's usually not supported by the NIH. But I would turn it more, I don't know that I would not review something because it didn't have external support. But as a mentee, I would really look for somebody who does have that external support and really knows how to help you move forward rather than just cranking out a whole bunch of papers.
I think that if something has been extramurally funded, sorry to use a big word, if something is, it means that it has undergone some degree of peer review. If something is not funded or not externally funded, doesn't mean that it's not good. It just means that it didn't go through that external peer review. Now, it is very easy to generalize, but we do see studies that were externally funded that weren't very good. We've seen studies that were internally funded that were absolutely positively outstanding. And so we look at funding and in part, that's part of managing potential conflicts of interest, for example, something I didn't have time to go into. But for example, if something is funded by an entity that has a potential stake in the outcome of the study, that's a potential for a conflict of interest. We look at those very carefully. And that's the area that we really pay close and careful attention to make sure that nobody's putting their thumb on the scale, if you will, and inadvertently or deliberately bringing bias, here comes this term bias again, and spin to the article. And if you pick up a copy of Anesthesiology, there's a statement on the cover that says trusted evidence. And that's sort of become a watchword for us. We ask ourselves as editors and reviewers, when we look at a manuscript, will this be trusted evidence? So that's really what we're looking at. Funding is a potential component of that decision-making process, but trusted evidence is what we're really after.
We have 1 minute left. We have another question. We have 2 more questions. So I'm going to say to everybody, if you need to leave, that's okay. I want to ask Dr. Kharasch and Dr. Culley, if you can stay on for a few more minutes, we'd be really grateful. I want to thank you both for just outstanding presentations. It was a bang up way to end our time together, and that's why we scheduled you last, because we knew it would be outstanding. I want to thank all our medical students for hanging in there all summer as everything was changing and still showing up and participating, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you all. And we have 2 more questions, and we're going to move to them now. So Elena, actually, I have a bunch more questions. They always come up with questions right at the top of the hour. So Elena.
Hi, thank you both for being here today. This has been really wonderful. My question is whether there's a rationale for journals only doing like single blind review instead of double blind. And I wonder if there may be a push for more to do double blind in the future, just like to reduce bias among reviewers related maybe to racial or gender bias on the author list, and or seniority in the author's career, and what your perspectives are on that.
That's a tough one. I think that all of us recognize that you know, we all have some biases, and we work hard to actively be aware of them, to actively overcome them. I read all the reviews of all the manuscripts that get reviewed for our journal, and we're really careful to attend to bias. Our journal does single blind review. And just for those people that didn't have time to look at the slides, single blinded review means that the authors of the article don't know who's reviewing their papers, but the reviewers know who wrote the paper. A double blind review means that the reviewers, in theory, don't know who wrote the paper, and the authors don't know who the reviewers are. I'll tell you that there are some appealing aspects of double blind review. And those go to issues of bias, you know, positive bias or negative bias. If a paper was written by somebody famous, maybe there's a bias towards thinking it's better. And I'll tell you that's sometimes true and sometimes not true. The problem is that it is very, very difficult to do double blind review. I've participated in double blind review, and talk about bias. First of all, it's extremely difficult to sanitize a paper in a way to make it impossible for a reviewer to know who wrote the paper. A good reviewer, it's like a mystery novel. You can figure out who done it no matter how hard an author tries to make it unidentifiable. And frankly, it's one of the first things you do as a reviewer if you get a blinded paper, is to see if you can figure out who wrote it. That's just sort of human nature. So I think that the goals of double-blind review are absolutely correct. The process is a lot more difficult.
Dr. Culley, do you have anything to say on double-blind review?
No, other than, you know, I agree with Evan completely, and having recently had an article that I was handling where there was a lot of emphasis on the stature of the individuals involved. It's really very difficult, but I agree with Evan. Without even knowing who the authors were, you would have known at least one of them just based upon the topic and the way that it was written. So I'm not sure that it's a noble goal and something that we should probably work for, but I'm just not sure that we will ever get there. If somebody was to read a paper on postoperative delirium from an IRB that was approved at Partners, they're going to know it's me or my group if it came from an anesthesia department. So, you know, I don't think you can really blind somebody to that.
And I will say, even though reviewers, even though authors are theoretically blinded to the reviewers, first they get to make some requests for reviewers so they have some idea who they are. Second, somebody will actually sign their names on the review. And third, I think reviewers who do a lot of reviewing develop sort of a signature style. And I will say that when there are groups of people who, when I review their paper, they give me feedback on my review because they know it was mine, even though I don't sign it. So it's a small world of who reviews papers and who writes papers. And so it's very hard to double blind. I think what's more important is for people to interrupt their bias to make, or to be aware of their bias so that they do the best review they can.
Great, thank you all.
Next we have Amanda.
Hi there. Thank you both for presenting today. So my question is, I was wondering if you could comment on the role of social media in disseminating research. And I've heard Twitter is really where a lot of people are turning to towards cultivating their social media presence and just connecting with like intellectual peers, and how we can best use social media to share publications and network.
Deb is smiling but not talking, and I will be very honest and tell you that I am not active in social media. However, I understand that social media is important. I know that our journal is putting a lot more effort into social media, and we have more and more engagement. And I think that my perspective on social media is that it is a wonderful way to make people aware of the existence of science, and to communicate that science has been done, and there may be interesting articles to read and from which you can learn. But it is very difficult to really communicate science well in a short number of characters. One of the things that we do with the journal is we now do something called visual abstracts, which is a one-panel graphic with words and pictures to try and capture the essence of the meaning of an article. And those graphics, for example, we call them visual abstracts, are very, very amenable to being communicated by social media. So I view this as a really good mechanism for communicating about the science. It's not quite as good for communicating the nitty-gritty and technicalities of the science.
Dr. Culley, are you going to weigh in?
Well, all that I would say is that the journal does a really good job of trying to use social media to help identify, or help you identify, recently published manuscripts within the journal. We also have a Twitter journal club that goes every once in a while that I would encourage you to participate in. But I would also warn you that it is not a peer-reviewed product that goes out there when you're twittering about a particular manuscript. And I've seen a few cases where what was written in the manuscript is not really what was suggested based upon the Twitter post. So I would be really careful not to take that information home without verifying it first.
Really good point. Really good point, Deb. Thank you.
And there are some great people out there to follow who do a really exceptional job of presenting articles. And I will say, anesthesiology has social media ambassadors whose job it is to retweet those, and I happen to be one of them. So I gave you my Twitter handle in case anybody wants to follow an old person who is on social media. We have another question from Benson.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. On one of our previous topics, I was just wondering out of curiosity if there was a lack of racial representation in anesthesia-related research. And I ask this because in class we're taught very common skin diseases, but more often than not, these teaching examples use Caucasian skin as to teach. And I was wondering if this was seen in anesthesia.
I'm a little unsure of the question. So can you sort of try rephrasing it again for me, please?
Yeah, of course. So I think this was from a long time ago, but I remember when we were learning metabolism enzymes on how drugs are metabolized in the liver, different ethnicities and different races have different kind of expression levels of these enzymes. but then when you try to research different drugs and how they work on patients, is there a lack of representation of certain racial groups about these drugs?
Okay, that's a little more specific. Thank you. It's an area I happen to know a little bit about because I do drug metabolism research. And you are correct that there can be some pretty substantial ethnic differences in drug disposition. And I think that the studies that get done do get published. Studies may get done because of regulatory requirements by agencies for the approval of new drugs. I don't know particularly. I know that they have age subgroups, they have disease subgroups. I don't know if they have requirements for ethnic subgroups, but I'm certainly aware of a lot of literature which has described ethnic and racial differences. Now, from the perspective of funders, here we get back to this issue of who's funding the research. If your research is funded by a federal agency in the United States, you have to describe the racial and ethnic makeup of the population that you intend to study. Now, what you do is going to have to comply with what the funding agency requires. So in the States, the federal agency requirements for ethnic and racial descriptions are discrete categories such as Black, Hispanic, Native American, Pacific Islanders, and there's a couple more. So you have to describe that to the funding agency. You may choose in your manuscript to provide that information or not provide that information. Interestingly enough, I don't think that most journals require it. We're still trying to get over the bar of just including the appropriate number of women in studies. So we have a long way to go. The other challenge is that often, as Deb said, it depends entirely on the demographics of the population that you have available to study. Deb and I both trained out in the University of Washington, where there is a very large Asian population. I'm now in Durham, North Carolina, where there's a very small Asian population. So you're kind of, you can only study what you have available. The challenge is in part that if you have really tiny numbers, you don't know what to do with them. So it was a really good question, and I apologize for giving you a really long answer. But that's sort of the best perspective I can give you, and I hope I've answered your question.
So I'd just like to add one thing to what Evan just said, and there is a lot of literature out there that underrepresented minorities are less likely to enroll in research projects. So even if you have them as a part of your population, it's probably a little bit harder to convince them or, for them to say that they're willing to participate. And I don't know why the exact reason is for that, but I've heard it's because of lack of trust. You don't look like me, you don't talk like me, you don't act like me. So I think your question was really good, really a great one, and one that we need to come up with better ways of addressing so that we really are, as investigators, as clinicians, more representative of the community as a whole.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're out of questions. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank our speakers for phenomenal presentations and answering great questions. You're going to get a survey from Olivia today. I really would be grateful to have you fill that out and give us some of your final thoughts on the entirety of our virtual MSARF program. We are considering we are very hopeful that next year our MSARF students will actually be in labs doing in-person research. We are considering incorporating some components of the MSARF into next year. So if you would think about like what might be good panel presentations or Q&A sessions, or should we have a couple journal clubs? Was the mentoring group helpful and you'd like to have that? You'd think that would have been great, even if you'd been with a specific mentor at an institution where you probably are surrounded by other mentors. We'd love to get some feedback on that. I also think you may have all heard, I think we are partnering with the AUA, because a lot of you ended up doing virtual research, to have a poster session at the the Association of University Anesthesiologists meetings, which is May 13th and 14th. And we just heard that they approved that yesterday. So if you have research that you've done and you're sad because in October we had to cancel the poster session because of the way the meeting is virtual, the May meeting will also be virtual, but we will be planning on a poster session. So talk to your mentor about keeping in mind that you may want to submit a poster. Dr. Kharasch, Dr. Culley, do you have any final remarks before we turn off our final session?
No, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to do this. I'm a strong supporter of FAIR. I was on the board and I got my start with a FAIR grant very early on. So I very much appreciate and understand the value of FAIR and what it does for our specialty. And thank you, Harriet, for what you do.
Very well said, Evan. I would just echo the same thing. FAIR is a wonderful organization, and I guess my parting comments would be congratulations to all of you, because I know you're going to have bright and shining careers, and that's primarily because you were participating in this program and had an opportunity to be a part of FAIR. So thank you, Harriet. Thank you, FAIR, but congratulations to all of the medical students.
Fantastic. Okay, everybody, have a great rest of your summer. I know you're already back in school. Thank you for joining us.